We are on Daf Dalid, page 4b, and we came close to the end of a piece of the Gemara, but we didn't actually finish it. So let's just go over what we did yesterday. So we started with the Gemara that was talking about when do you start mentioning rain, when do you start asking for rain. We mentioned Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and we had a contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion because Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah said you start on Shmini Atzeres, and Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah on page 5 says you start on the end of 1 second. Let me start again. We had a contradiction, Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah said, when do you end? When do you end saying Masha V'roch Amar Geshem? So our Mishnah on page 2 said you end on Pesach, the first day of Pesach, and Rabbi Yehuda on page 5 says you end at the end of Pesach. So that was the contradiction. The Gemara had tried numerous ways of answering it. One way was that there's a difference between mentioning and asking, and but then the Gemara said that doesn't flow because why would you continue asking after you stop mentioning? That doesn't make sense. So we had the answer of that there's two authors, there's two sources of Rabbi Yehuda's view, and two rabbis understood Rabbi Yehuda differently. And so these are two different authors, meaning one quoted two different quotes. One quoted Rabbi Yehuda one way, one quoted Rabbi Yehuda the other way. The Gemara tried to give a few other answers, that when do you stop at it doesn't mean the end of Pesach, it means maybe it means at the after you bring, or after you're able to bring, after you start being able to bring the sacrifice called Pesach. So maybe that's what it meant. But even that, the Gemara said that it doesn't make sense. And the Gemara got into the question of is She'ela, do you even ask for rain on Yantiv? And that was there's, in other words, there's another answer that it means not until the end of Pesach, it means until you finish Shachris on the first day of Pesach. So that's what it meant to really. So the Gemara says, but you don't ask for rain on the first day of Pesach because it's a holiday. The Gemara says, well, the Maturgaban mentions it in his drasha, in his speech. The Gemara said, well, that also is not so true because would he mention something that the community doesn't need or doesn't ask for? So the Gemara concludes that it's basically two different versions of Rabbi Yehuda. We have our Mishnah's version is that everything ends at Musaf on Pesach, the mentioning of the rain, and we have the Rabbi Yehuda of the Mishnah that says it ends on at the end of Pesach. That's when you end asking for rain. Okay, so that was that first Gemara, and we spoke a little about the very surprising opinion of the Torah, where the Torah mentions that you're supposed to ask for rain until Musaf, and the surprising thing about that statement is you don't even have it in the prayers. So how could you stop asking for rain in the Musaf if it's not you don't ask for rain? It's not part of the Siddur. So it doesn't even have it there in Shachris or in Ma'ariv. So what does the Torah mean that you stop asking for rain in Musaf? So we mentioned that there is an opinion that the Bach wants to learn it, and maybe others, they want to learn that it means if you make a mistake and include the same Talmud Matar, that you include Baruch Aleinu in your Yantiv Shemona Esrei, you're actually supposed to include the same Talmud Matar. Very surprising, very interesting insight. And we spoke about how that fits with our Gemara, because our Gemara seems to say it's not the time. So we explained that our Gemara is talking about the Chazan; it's not talking about the community. So we did discuss that. But we also mentioned that the Magen Avraham argues and says that it's not appropriate if you include Baruch Aleinu, the paragraph that asks for rain, in your holiday Shemona Esrei, even though you're not supposed to include it. do not ask for rain. The Magen Avraham says it's not the time, and he proves it from our Gemara. So we spoke a little about that yesterday. And then the Gemara, we got into the next piece of the Gemara, where the Gemara seems to be contradictory as to who the halacha follows. Like Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha follows like Rabbi Yehuda, and Rav Elazar. Elazar said that the halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel. What were they arguing about? Well, the issue was when do you start? So the beginning of the Gemara yesterday was when do you finish asking or mentioning rain. The second part of the Gemara, the later part of the Gemara was is like when do you start asking and who the halacha follows. So if the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, you start asking for rain on Shmini Atzeres, on the Shmini Atzeres of Shmini Atzeres and Musaf time, and that would be the halacha to Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yochanan's view. And the Mishnah later says you start asking for rain on Zayin Marcheshvan, according to Rabbi Gamliel, and Rav Elazar says that's the halacha, that you start at the 7th of Cheshvan. And so it seems like a contradiction of who the halacha follows. Do you start Shmini Atzeres or the 7th of Cheshvan? So the Gemara says there's two very simple answers to this contradiction. One is that it's not a contradiction in the first place because they're two different rabbis. Each one says the halacha follows someone else. That's not surprising. They're two different opinions. If it's one rabbi saying the halacha follows him and the halacha follows someone else, that's a problem. But if it's two separate rabbis, it's not a problem. And the second point, the second difference is that one is talking about when do you start asking for rain. The other is talking about when you start mentioning rain. And here, there's a very logical difference that you could start mentioning rain much earlier than you ask for rain because it's called ritzui. Ritzui means appeasing and it's praising Hashem in a way that leads up to your ask. So you first do an appeasement and a praise, and then you ask. So these are two very obvious differences. But the Gemara is not satisfied with these different. Well, the Gemara is not satisfied with the fact that there's a difference between asking and mentioning. The Gemara, they are two different opinions. So that's not really proven wrong. And that answer is not disproven. They are two separate opinions. But when it comes to the other point that there's a difference between asking and mentioning, that the Gemara doesn't seem satisfied with. And the reason why it's not satisfied with it is because we have a statement from Rabbi Yochanan himself who says that when you, in the place where you ask for rain, that's when you mention rain. And even though you could say, oh, that means when you stop, but the Gemara says that's not true. Rabbi Yochanan says clearly in another place, when you start mentioning, you also start asking. When you stop asking, you stop mentioning. So he says they go hand in hand. Again, in practice, we don't follow this. In practice, we mention rain much before we ask for rain. And in Israel, the way it's done is on Shmini Atzeres, they start mentioning, and on Zayin Cheshvan, they start asking. So it's like 2 weeks later. And but Rabbi Yochanan seems to follow this. That Rabbi Yochanan says this, that you start and stop at the same time. And so Rabbi Yochanan that answer can't flow. In other words, if Rabbi Yochanan holds that you mention rain on Shmini Atzeres, then you would have to start asking for rain then as well. If Rabbi Yochanan holds Zayin Cheshvan, the 7th of, what you start asking, that would mean you would start mentioning there as well. So we're talking about the beginning of the mentioning and the asking, and we're basically saying that Rabbi Yochanan holds they go hand in hand, that the day whenever you start asking or mentioning, you start asking, it goes together. It's a package deal. So the Gemara said that the answer the Gemara wants to give is that there's a difference between Babylon and Israel, and that's where we are up to. So let me tell you what line we're on. We're on page 4b, and we are 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. And in the art scroll, let me open it up over here and I'll tell you we're on 4b and we are 4b3. 4b3, the third paragraph.
Rabbi,
4B, the third paragraph. Yes, David.
I'm sorry I didn't stop you when you were mentioning it, but when you mentioned about the Borech Aleinu,
Yes.
and yeah, that was very insightful. That's very interesting. That he was saying that if you're making a mistake, at least it has to be a proper mistake.
Well, what it means is, it's not exactly a mistake, and the reason being, officially, we should mention the brachos of Shemona Esrei, the weekday brachos in Shemona Esrei, even on Shabbos. But the rabbis were, kind to like minimize our Shemona Esrei to a much smaller Shemona Esrei. So it's like they were lenient for us not to include it. So there is a concept, that officially the Shemona Esrei, is there, but it is a mistake. I mean, it's not in the Siddur and it's not supposed to be mentioned. But it's, in other words, there is if you do mention it, you got to do it right. Otherwise, the Shemona Esrei will be invalid. So it makes sense that it should be right. If you make a mistake, you got to do it. You got to make a good mistake, but you to say it right, because you're in the end of, if you look at that Shemona Esrei, it's not called a mistake in Shemona Esrei. That Shemona Esrei is going to be your valid Shemona Esrei, even though it includes weekday requests. It is going to be considered your Shemona Esrei. So you definitely have to do it right. And if you say the wrong thing in that, you ruin it.
Mm-hmm. That's even more interesting.
Yeah, there are many things like that. That if you didn't include it, no problem. But once you include it, you got to do it right.
Right.
If you do it wrong, you ruin it. You didn't have to do it, but if you do it, you can't do it wrong. Yeah.
I like that.
Didn't get the line or the page that you're gonna start.
No problem. Let me repeat it. We're on 4B.
4B, okay.
4B, 8 lines up from the bottom.
And what's the line?
The line begins with lehazkir.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, I have Rabbi Yochanan. Bisman she'en bet hamikdash.
Then the line after that. Oh, Bisman she'en bet hamikdash. 1 second. Then it's 1 line, 2 lines up from that. Two lines more.
Okay. The Itlan Perei Bedavra.
Ela lo kasha holan v'halahu. A few words before your.
Okay. Ela lo kasha ha.
Yeah. You got it.
Got it.
Lo kasha. Okay. So that's where we're up to. Ela lo kasha. Rather, it's not a question. And the Gemara says that, how are we going to answer this problem? When do you start? What's the halacha? So the Gemara answers, halon v'halahu. This is lun for us, and this is for them. Who's them? And the Gemara says, us in them, and this is the Babylonian Talmud. So us means in Bavel and Babylon, and them means in Israel. So there's a difference between the law when to start mentioning the rain between Israel and Babylon. That's going to be a difference. Why would there be such a difference? So the reason for such a difference is that in Bavel, they would leave out the grain longer. In Israel, they brought it into their storage houses already. And in Babylon, they have the grain and the fruits and the fields, all of Tishrei. So they would wait until the 7th of Tishrei, of Cheshvan, in order to ask for rain. And when they start mentioning, they would start asking, would be in the 7th of Cheshvan. But in Eretz Yisrael, where they harvest in Nisan, they gather it in from the fields in Tishrei. And that means it's all the produce is already inside. So in the end of Sukkot, they could already start mentioning and asking for rain. So that would be the Gemara's answer, that you would begin in Israel at a different time than you would begin in Babylon, and that would be the answer to this contradiction of the different dates. Depends if you're in Babylon or in Eretz Yisrael. So the bottom line seems to be that in Israel, the harvest was earlier than in Babylon. That's what it boils down to. It seems that that's what the emphasis is. That because in Israel the harvest was earlier, so that would make that the bringing into the storage houses would be earlier as well, and it would be done by Shmini Atzeres. You'd be all set.
So in Israel, you ask for rain on Shmini Atzeret?
Now, this is not the halacha again. This is not the halacha. This is the Gemara's discussion about it. So don't make any conclusions.
What's the halacha?
The halacha is that in Israel, they do mention rain on Shmini Atzeres, and they ask for rain on the 7th of Cheshvan, which doesn't follow this logic of Rabbi
Yeshua. So that I have written down.
Yeah.
But so in Bavel, when do they ask for rain?
So according to this, they would ask for rain right after Shmini Atzeres, seemingly. Because if we're following that idea that it goes together hand in hand, asking and mentioning, so they would seemingly mention rain Shmini Atzeres and ask for rain right when the first Shmona Esrei comes that you can ask for rain. They would ask for rain. That's what that would be.
What is after Shmini Atzeret? It's Simchas Torah, isn't it?
Yeah. But you don't ask for. But we don't ask. Well, in Israel, they don't have Simchas Torah. It's the same day. Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah in Israel.
Oh, in Israel, and in Bavel they have. So, but Bavel, you say the day after they ask for the rain.
No, but in Bavel, we just said that they wouldn't start mentioning or asking until the 7th of Cheshvan. So we don't have any problem. It's not Yontiv there that time. So that's not a problem. At least that would be the simple understanding here. And now okay, so back to the Gemara over here. So the Gemara asks, "My shna ledidan de islan peri bedabra." Why is it different for us that we have fruit in the desert? Lididhu nami islahu oile regalim. They also who knows? We have fruit in the desert, so therefore our fruit needs to dry out, and we need to wait longer until it's ready. So we don't want rain. So therefore we wait until the 7th of Cheshvan. Lididhu nami, for them as well. Islahu oile regalim. They have people that are being oile regel. They also have people that are oile regel, and if it rains for them, it's not going to be good. When they return from coming to the Beis Hamikdash, the pilgrimage to the Beis Hamikdash, they're going to be returning back home after Sukkot, and it's not going to be good for them. So the Gemara is basically saying that you want the people in Israel to start mentioning and asking for rain on Shmini Atzeres, because the fruits in the field, the fruits are going to be, there's not a problem. They don't need to dry out anymore. And you don't mind if it rains. But what about walking back from being oila from the pilgrimage? So they also should start at the 7th of Cheshvan. In other words, the way the Gemara is explaining it now, surprisingly, it explains Babylon needs to be later and Israel could be earlier. So Babylon can start everything at the 7th of Cheshvan, but in Israel, they start at Shmini Atzeres. And where it says that, what about the people returning from pilgrimage? They're going to get wet. So they also should wait until until 7th of Cheshvan. So the Gemara answers, Ki ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan. When does Rabbi Yochanan say his law? Bisman, at a time she'ein Beis Hamikdash kayom, when there's no Beis Hamikdash. So if there's no Beis Hamikdash, then there's not the pilgrimage. And if there's no pilgrimage, then Eretz Yisrael, they can start mentioning and asking for rain, Shmini Atzeres, and it's not a problem. People are going to get wet. No, they're not. They didn't go to Israel because it's not the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara here concludes and says, "Hashta da asis lahachi." Now that we've reached this difference and this understanding, that we've come to this. Now that we've come to this, we could say that both are talking about Israel, and it's not a problem because we could say one is in the time when the Beis Hamikdash is around, and one is in a time when the Beis Hamikdash is not around. So let's read it inside. But like they're both talking about in Eretz Yisrael, and Khan Bisman Beis Hamikdash Kayom. One is in a time when the Beis Hamikdash is in existence, so we want to push off the request for rain. We're going to push it off until Zayin Cheshvan because we don't want people to get wet, and we're not worried about the fruits and the grain, but we are worried about people getting wet. Khan Bisman Shein Beis Hamikdash Kayom, and here when the people in the there's no Beis Hamikdash, so they're not going to be traveling. They're not doing the pilgrimage, and therefore they can all start on Shmini Atzeres. So this is the pretty much the conclusion. The Gemara just ends off with what about when us that do 2 days of Yom Tov. So which day is the day that we're supposed to do it? Because the day of Shmini Atzeres is questionable. If it's really Shmini Atzeres, it might be Hoshana Rabbah, because with the 8th day is a question if it's a 7th day, and the 9th day is why do we add a 9th day? Because we're not sure if it's really the 8th day, because we could be a day off, right? Why do we add a day? Why do we add an extra day outside of Israel? We add an extra day because we're always not sure. So the Gemara asks, so what are we supposed to do? What day do we consider Shmini Atzeres? Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah said that you're supposed to start asking, mentioning in the time of Shmini Atzeres, what day do we call Shmini Atzeres really? Because really the 8th day you could call Shmini Atzeres, but the 9th day you could also call Shmini Atzeres, because the 9th day is questionable if it's the 8th day. The 8th day is questionable if it's the 7th day. Why do we have 2 days of Yom Tov? Because each day we're not sure if today is Yom Tov or the next day is Yom Tov based on when was the Chodesh, when was the month sanctified? Was the month sanctified on the 30th day of the previous month or on the 31st day of the previous month? It was sanctified. Now, did we start the new month after 30 days of the previous month or after 30 or on the 31st day of the previous month? So that question has an impact on the holidays. And that's why on the holidays outside of Israel, we always used to, and we continue the tradition, but we're doing it as a way that it's like unclear if today is the first day of Sukkot or is today not Sukkot yet, and tomorrow is really the first day. That's why we have 2 days in the beginning of Sukkot. The end of Sukkot is the same thing. We're not sure if today is really Shmini Atzeres or maybe it's before the Shmini Atzeres, and tomorrow on Simchas Torah, that's really the real Shmini Atzeres. So that was the initial reason why we started having 2 days of Yom Tov. So the Gemara wants to know which day should we start mentioning the rain on, which is supposed to be on Shmini Atzeres. Which day would that be outside of Israel?
How can they have it the same time? You said that when the Beit HaMikdash exists, they can do it at the same time.
So the previous Gemara was talking about when the Beis HaMikdash existed. So then in Israel itself, they would have to deal with, in Israel itself, they would deal with the issues of in Israel itself. They would do it on. Let me just mute everyone. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, when would they do it? So seemingly, we would have to push everything off until the 7th of Cheshvan, because we don't want people to get wet. No, I don't hear you. Sorry, Ben. You got to unmute. Ben, you're muted. Sorry, I muted you.
We just talked about it, and I wrote it down. In Israel, they're asking for rain in Shmini Atzeret because there is no Beit HaMikdash. And in Bavel, they mention in Shmini Atzeret and ask in 7th of Cheshvan.
So this is the thing. The Gemara, when it comes to this answer, that there's a difference between, in Israel itself, between when there's a Beis Hamikdash and when there's no Beis Hamikdash. Once you explain it, that in Israel itself, there's a difference if there's a Beis Hamikdash, no Beis Hamikdash. So the understanding is that now we'll just divide that. That will be the deciding factor. So if there is a Beis Hamikdash, everywhere starts on Zayin Cheshvan. If there's no Beis Hamikdash, everyone starts on Shmini Atzeres. So this is like the answer of the Gemara that sort of like washes away the previous thought. The previous assumption is washed away. So now outside of Israel, when are we actually going to mention rain? Shmini Atzeres. Okay. So now that we have 2 days, the Gemara is saying, which day should we do as Shmini Atzeres? It's a good question. You're asking a good question. Ben is asking if you keep the continuation of the Gemara. The Gemara just said that outside of Israel, we start on Zayin Cheshvan. We start on the 7th of Cheshvan. So what's the question over here? We that do 2 days. Who cares when you do 2 days? You did 2 days last month in Tishrei. You did 2 days of Shmini Atzeres. We're supposed to be, we're dealing with the 7th of Cheshvan. Good question.
Rabbi?
So the answer to your question is that the Gemara, and it's asked, actually one of the commentaries asked your question, but the way he explains it is that the Gemara is basically changing its assumption at this point. And once it comes to this conclusion where it uses the term hashta di asis lahachi, now that we've come to this understanding, which means like we can actually explain it differently. And now that we've come to this understanding, we forget about what we said before, and we're going to just rely on that there's a difference between if there's a Beis Hamikdash or there's no Beis Hamikdash. And that would be this. So
what's the conclusion if there is Beit HaMikdash?
If there is a Beis HaMikdash, then we push everyone off until Zayin Cheshvan because we don't want people getting wet.
Okay. Yes.
Rabbi?
Yes, Moshe.
Well, in Chutz La'aretz, I mean, there's 2 days during most Chagim. I mean, we have 2 days. So what is this the same apply to every Chag? I mean, that we don't know. We're not certain which day. I mean, that's why we have 2 days.
Yeah. Except there are Chagim that we celebrate 2 days, even though we know, like Shavuos. And the reason is because we don't want to differentiate between Shavuos and the other holidays. Now, I will tell you something interesting, and that is that they would sanctify the new month on Rosh Hashanah, right? Now, if in order to find out about when Sukkot is, they didn't have 15 days because they didn't go traveling. No, they wanted to spread the word. They have to go tell everyone when we sanctified Rosh Hashanah, which day was Rosh Hashanah. So they go around to all the different cities, but they have to wait till Rosh Hashanah is over. And they also can't travel on Yom Kippur. So they lose a few days. Now compare that to Nisan. The month of Nisan, they would sanctify the month of Nisan, and then they would send emissaries out to go spread the word. But in Nisan, they have an extra 2 days. They have Rosh Hashanah and they have Yom Kippur to go spreading the word. So there were cities that found out when they sanctified the new month of Nisan, but they would not know when Rosh Hashanah, when Tishrei was sanctified. So you had cities that would have been able, theoretically, to celebrate Pesach in one day, only one Seder, but they would not have been able to celebrate one day of Sukkot because the emissaries would not have reached them. So theoretically, that could have been the halacha, and they would have celebrated Sukkot 2 days and Pesach 1 day. But it doesn't come out that way. What happened is that the rabbi said, whatever place, if they celebrate Pesach 2 days, they have to celebrate Sukkot as well 2 days. So it became like a blanket rule. You're an area where they didn't reach the shluchim of Tishrei didn't reach. If you celebrate Sukkot 2 days, you got to celebrate Pesach as well 2 days, even though the emissaries could reach you for Nisan, but they're not going to reach you for Tishrei. You get what I'm saying?
Yes,
So basically, every city had a rule for that city. It wasn't depending on the holiday; it depended on the city. If that's a city, a 2 day city, then all the holidays were 2 days. If that's a city that's a 1 day city, then all the holidays are 1 day.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there is a question among the commentaries. We do know a lot of people travel to Yerushalayim on the holidays called,
Rabbi, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but isn't Shavuot 2 day holiday?
So Shavuos, if you celebrate Sukkot 2 days and you celebrate Pesach 2 days, then you celebrate Shavuos 2 days, even though we know when Shavuos is.
Yeah.
Even though we will know, based on it's the 50th day from the Omer, right?
Right. Okay.
So we do know when Shavuos is going to be, but we still celebrate it 2 days. Shalei l'chalik bein hamayados, so we don't differentiate. So
Rabbi?
Yes, Ezra.
Again, I have this particular situation. We know that you're supposed to count 50 days from the day after Pesach. Okay. Now, if you're celebrating the first 2 days because of Pesach, because you really don't know what the first day is, so can't you use the same argument and say the same thing to define the second day of Shavuot?
No, because they'll find out in the next 49 days to find out when Pesach was. You'll be able to find out. So you won't have a problem. You have enough days there. That's 49 days. Within 49 days, you'll find out when the Pesach really was.
So, I mean, by means of travelers, people being sent out from Beit HaMikdash to all the parts of
Yeah. Within
Jewish
that
world.
time, then there was no question. Yeah, you have it. In other words, we never had a situation where people had to keep 3 days because they're so far, they're so far off that they might be 3 days off already, right? But we never had that because ultimately they would find out, how, so they could. It was only a question of 2 days. It was never a question of 1 day.
Okay.
So I was mentioning that there are people who travel to Yerushalayim for Yom Tov, and there seems to be a question of if there's no Beis Hamikdash, is there any inyan? Is there any importance or law or rule that a person should travel to be Oila Regel to if there's no Beis Hamikdash, just to go to Yerushalayim? That's where the Shechina is. The Shechina is there. There's an extra level of Shechina. Of course, Hashem is everywhere, but there's an extra level of Shechina, Yerushalayim. So would there be an inyan to go to Yerushalayim if there's no Beis Hamikdash? So our Gemara seems to prove one way. Can anyone see a proof from our Gemara if there's a mitzvah to go to Yerushalayim if there's no Beis Hamikdash? In other words, there's 2 reasons why you might want to go to Yerushalayim for the holidays. One is because you need to bring the sacrifices. If the purpose of going to pilgrimage is to bring the sacrifices, then if there's no Beis Hamikdash, then you're not bringing sacrifices, then there's obviously no reason to go to Yerushalayim. But if the reason to go to Yerushalayim is to be seen by Hashem, so to speak, and to be part of the to go to Yerushalayim as a special holy place, at least 3 times a year, and honor Hashem and show honor Hashem with your presence. So if that would be the goal, then maybe it could apply even if there's no Beis Hamikdash. So what do we see in our Gemara? Is there a mitzvah to go to Yerushalayim if there's no Beis Hamikdash for the holidays?
Rabbi?
Yes, Moshe.
Doesn't the tefillah act in the capacity of a sacrifice? I mean, if you, in addition to the Shekhinah in Yerushalayim?
Yeah, but that tefillah you could do anywhere. You don't need to be in Yerushalayim to do the tefillah.
But in combination with the Shekhinah of Yerushalayim, it's different.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well,
you
the question would be,
you go to the hotel, it's not the same as doing it on a plane. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. The only thing is, then you could still ask the question. The question would be, is the tefillah sacrifice considered fulfillment of bringing the karbanos, the oilas re'iyah, the shalmei simcha, the shalmei chagiga? Is that considered enough to say that you have a obligation to go to Yerushalayim if there's no Beis Hamikdash, or do you need the physical sacrifice in order to fulfill the mitzvah and to be obligated in the mitzvah of Oila Regel? You get what I'm saying? In other words, you could say it's a bigger inyan. I'm not sure if that's correct, that it's more fulfillment of that sacrifice, because the law is that learning Torah is like beyond limit, beyond time, beyond space, beyond play, so like it would seem to me like maybe you could fulfill the same sacrifice anywhere. The learning Torah is considered as if you brought that sacrifice. But the thing is that if maybe there is such a concept that it's a little more fulfillment of it in Yerushalayim. But even so, it would still be a question: would there be a mitzvah to go nowadays, and if you're not bringing the physical sacrifice, because the mitzvah of the Torah is to bring the physical sacrifice? So would there be a mitzvah even if you're not going to be bringing the physical sacrifices nowadays? So our Gemara seems to prove one way. The Gemara that we just learned. The Gemara said that when is it a problem that people might get caught in the rain? Only Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayom. Only at a time that there's a Beis Hamikdash. When there's no Beis Hamikdash, we can start mentioning rain or asking for rain at Shmini Atzeres. What do we see from this Gemara? What we see from here is that if there's no Beis Hamikdash, then people are not doing the pilgrimage. We don't have to push off and save and help the people who are traveling. We're not worried about that. It's not a problem because they don't do the pilgrimage. If there's no Beis Hamikdash, you're not bringing the korban, then you don't have to go. So therefore, we can start mentioning and asking for rain on Shmini Atzeres. Right?
But it won't be the same time as in Chutz La'aretz.
Well, that's a little confusing, but it seems like the conclusion of the Gemara is that that maybe it could be the same. It could be all the same time. In other words, it's a little unclear how the Gemara concludes over here, especially because we don't really follow this logic of starting asking and mentioning at the same time. We don't. It's a little confusing how to follow this. Who the halacha goes like, but maybe we'll get into that at another time exactly how to deal with that. But what we do see is from
they would wait until Cheshvan.
You have to understand the Gemara does continue about this the 60 days after the vernal equinox. So
I'm already confused. So I'm trying to figure it out now.
Well. For you don't have to be confused now. Later. We can here. There's no reason to be confused. Very simple. The Gemara is emphasizing that there's a difference between the time that there's a Beis Hamikdash and there's no time when there's a Beis Hamikdash. If there's a Beis Hamikdash, then we cannot daven for rain on Shmini Atzeres. Why? people will
Because
get
of
wet.
the extra day.
No, and people are going to get wet walking home. It takes them 2 weeks to get home, right?
Oh, okay.
People are going to get wet. So when should we start asking or mentioning rain for if there's a Beis Hamikdash? Zayin Cheshvan. This is the conclusion of the Gemara. Again, it's not the final halacha everywhere, but this is the conclusion of this Gemara, is that you don't ask or mention rain until Zayin Cheshvan if there's a Beis Hamikdash around. Why?
Right.
Because we don't want people to get wet. The Gemara earlier said that in Bavel they wouldn't ask for rain either until Zayin Cheshvan because we don't want the grain or fruit to get wet. But now in the conclusion of the Gemara wants to say even in Israel, let's make a differentiation in Israel if there's a Beis Hamikdash or there's no Beis Hamikdash. If there's a Beis Hamikdash, we don't want people to get wet in Israel, so we would push everything off until when? Zayin Cheshvan. What about if there's no Beis Hamikdash? We can start asking and mentioning rain, Shmini Atzeres. That's the conclusion of this piece of Gemara. Right? Now, and I just mentioned that it seems pretty clear from here. It seems like one of the proofs. Well, there is a proof from here that the mitzvah of Oila Regel would not apply if you don't bring korbanos if there's no Beis Hamikdash. And the question that was asked, Mordechai, is Mordechai here? Mordechai, doesn't look like, looks like he slipped out. He had asked a question. I wanted to answer it. We had this question, and Ezra answered it the other day. We had a question of why are we worried about the pilgrims that are traveling back to their homes, that they're going to get wet? And so we push off asking for rain 2 weeks. Why? Oh, here he is.
No, it's 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2
Yeah.
weeks.
That's what I said.
The holiday ends the 22nd or 23rd of Tishrei, depending on how you want to count it. So it's 1 week
2 weeks.
to Chodesh or Shodesh, and then another week is the 7th of Cheshvan.
Yeah, Mordechai, we wanted to mention your question. Mordechai, are you still there? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so you had asked this very strong question as to why are we worried about people getting wet? So we push off asking for rain 2 weeks in order for people to get home before the rain starts pouring. What about before Pesach when they travel to the Beis Hamikdash? Shouldn't we be concerned about people getting wet on the way to the Beis Hamikdash, and let's stop asking for rain 2 weeks earlier? So instead of ending the first day of Pesach, we should end 2 weeks earlier so people won't get wet on their way traveling to Yerushalayim. So it's interesting that we don't find this question in the Rishonim, but someone from the previous this generation just passed away. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach asked this question. So he answers. There seems to be a few. He answers a few thoughts. I liked what Ezra said. Ezra said that it has to do with the rains. That the earlier rains are maybe more. They would cause more concern than the later rains. And I think that would be an interesting answer if you could back it up with scientific evidence. Ezra, I'd like, that would be interesting to put together something like that to look into that. But Shlomo Zalman has a few points. He says one is that to push off starting to ask for rain is okay, but once a blessing is coming, to stop it is a problem. We don't normally stop a bracha from coming. So to stop, mentioning and asking rain would be a problem. It's not something that we normally do. In other words, if it's officially good for the rain to come, it's a time of rain, and to go and stop asking and mentioning and asking for rain, that wouldn't be appropriate. He also says that the people who would come for Pesach, they would bring their raincoats because it's during the time of rain. They had no problem. The people who came for Sukkot, they didn't have clothing meant for the winter yet. They're not bringing along the clothing, the rainy season. So therefore, they would get really sopping if it started to rain before before they got home. So because of that, because of these two reasons, he says that's why there seems to be a difference. Anyway, that's the answers that I so far that I've found. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say maybe it's because the Talmud was written in Bavel. There was no Beit HaMikdash when the Talmud was written then in Bavel.
Well, there was a second Beis HaMikdash. The second Beis HaMikdash. When they were during the time.
Bavel was after the second Beit HaMikdash.
Well, people were in Babylon during the exile of the first Beis HaMikdash. That's when it became a whatchamacallit. It became
That's when they wrote the Talmud.
So the thing is, it became a place, a location of Jewish Jewish success and life started during the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, at the time of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Now, throughout the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, there was Jewish life in Babylon. A lot of people never even traveled. They didn't travel back to Eretz Yisrael. And throughout that time, so towards the end of that time, you had some of the like the Tanoim were living at the end, at the end of the time of the Beis HaMikdash, like Rabbi Akiva and so on. And then after Rabbi Akiva, his colleagues, after they passed away, or they lived during the destruction. So after that was the rabbis of the Talmud. But the rabbis of the Mishnah, at least, were, there were some, rabbis that lived during the time of the Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah, I wanted to say if there was no Beit HaMikdash, they weren't worried about people going to Beit HaMikdash on Pesach.
Right. But the thing is, in the Mishnah, it would have mentioned, there should be halachas based on in the Mishnayos that talk about during the time of the Beit HaMikdash.
Okay.
So, so the Gemara here, so going back to our Gemara, so we're at the bottom of page 4b, and we just answered this difference between the time of the Beis HaMikdash or when there's no Beis HaMikdash. Then the Gemara asked this question about the 2 days and when do we really start mentioning the rain or asking for rain if we have questionable 2 days, because Shmini Atzeres might really be the 7th day, even though we call it the 8th day, but it's a suffix, and that's why we eat in the sukkah. In almost all groups, they eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, except there's one minhag among certain types of Chassidim that don't. But the general accepted view from the Gemara seems to be very clear that we're supposed to eat in the sukkah on the 8th day. Why are we eating in the sukkah on the 8th day of Sukkot? There's no mitzvah to eat in the sukkah on the 8th day. The reason is because it might be Hoshana Rabbah, it might be the 7th day. And so we continue that tradition. We don't shake lulav, but we do eat in the sukkah. So the 8th day is really possibly the 7th day, and that means the 9th day might really be the 8th day. And because of that, the Gemara asks, so we that do 2 days, Heichai of Dinon, how do we do this with regard to mentioning rain? So Amar Rav comes up with this very surprising way of satisfying this suffix, this question as to which day is which. Is this really Shmini Atzeres or is it tomorrow? So he says, Maschal b'musafin, you start Musaf of the Shmini Atzeres, because Shmini Atzeres might really be Shmini Atzeres, might be the 8th day. Upaise, but you stop mentioning rain on Mincha b'Mincha, So you start Musaf, you stop Mincha, Arvis v'Shachris, and you stop Ma'ariv, the night prayer, in the morning prayer. V'Chayzer b'Musafin, and then you continue. You start again at Musaf the next day on Simchas Torah, and you continue from there and forward. Now, so that would be the understanding of at least this is how Rav understands how to fulfill, both of these issues. On the one hand, it's a suffix. On the other hand, we're supposed to start on Shmini Atzeres. It's a suffix. Suffix means a doubt. We're not sure. We're not sure if it's really the 8th day or the 7th day. So he comes up with some type of a medium of like fitting, doing a little of this, a little of that. Amar lahu Shmuel. Shmuel said to them, to the people who repeated Rav's opinion. So Shmuel said to them, Kuku, go out, ve'imru leili Abba, and go tell my friend, meaning Rav, after you made this holy, you're going to now make it a weekday, a mundane. In other words, you're calling it Yom Tov Shmini Atzeres. So you're starting to ask for rain, or mention rain. And then you're going to go and you're going to go and stop your stop asking for rain, meaning that you're going to consider it Hoshana Rabbah. You're going to consider this the 7th day of Pesach. You're going to say, call it a weekday. It's like a zilzul it's a disgrace for the holiday. In other words, you're calling it a holiday, and then you're not calling it a holiday. So you're disgracing the holiday. So you made it kodesh, you made it holy, and then you're going to make it chayil, a weekday. Ella Amar Shmuel. Rather, Shmuel says, Maskal b'musafin. You start at the musaf of Shmini Atzeres. B'mincha. And by mincha. So you start b'musafin u'b'mincha. And this way you made Shmini Atzeres into a holiday. U'paisek arves v'shachris. And then you stop. For Ma'ariv and Shachris, you could stop because you didn't make that day into a holiday yet. And we're not sure, maybe that could be that the real Shmini Atzeres is really the 9th day. And you would start then on Musaf. So don't say it Ma'ariv or Shachris. And then and then you continue. You start again and continue at Musaf on Simchas Torah. So that is the second view we have. We have Rav's view. We have Shmuel's. Now, we turn the page to 5a. Rava Amar, Rava says, so we have Rav, Shmuel, and now Rava. Rava says, Kivan shehischel shuvene paisek. Once you start, you do not stop anymore. Once you start on Shmini Atzeres, don't stop. That would be what we seemingly follow. We start on Shmini Atzeres and we don't stop. V'cheinam Rav Sheshes, and so does Rav Sheshes say that Kivan shehischel shuvene paisek. Once you start, you don't stop at all. Rav Hadarbe, and even Rav changed his view, retracted, and he returned and followed this view. The Amar Rav Chananel Amar Rav, because Rav Chananel said in his name, Moina Esrim Echad Yoim, you count 21 days. Kederach Shemoina Asara Yom, the same way you count 10 days, Me Rosh Hashanah Ad Yom Kippur, meaning you start with the first day, you count the first day, and you count 21 days. And then umaschel, and then you start. So you count 21 days from Rosh Hashanah till Shmini Atzeres, and then you start the day after it. and you start on the 22nd day. And once you start, you don't stop. So you count 21 days, and then you start. And once you start, you don't stop. And the halacha is that once you start, you don't stop from Shmini Atzeres, even outside of Israel. Okay, so that is the conclusion of this little piece of Gemara before we start the Mishnah, which we've already heard about in the Gemara. We had a little of this Mishnah already. So let's just go over what we've concluded here. So we concluded that on outside of Israel, where you have 2 days of Yom Tov, we had a few different views of how do you do Shmini Atzeres, because we don't know what day really is Shmini Atzeres. And as I explained before, this Gemara seems to be understanding that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash is they do it one way, and after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we do things differently, or when there's no Beis Hamikdash, and that would apply outside of Israel and as well. And in other words, that rule would apply even outside of Israel. And so we do 2 days outside of Israel. When you do 1 day in Eretz Yisrael, it's no problem. You do it on Shmini Atzeres. But what about when you do 2 days? So the Gemara's conclusion is that you do the Shmini Atzeres the way we know Shmini Atzeres, what we call Shmini Atzeres, even though it might really be the 7th day of Pesach, of Sukkot. We follow Shmini Atzeres as it is, and we start then Mashiv Aruach Merda Geshem, and that's the halach. Now comes the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, Ad Masai Shayel and Esag Shamim, until when do we ask for rain? So it's mentioning the end time. Until when do we ask for rain? Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad Sheyavar HaPesach. Rabbi Yehuda says until Pesach is over. And we learned a few explanations, at least a few thoughts of what that meant. Does it mean literally until the end of Pesach? Does it mean until the end of the first day of the Shachris, the end of the Shachris of the first day of Pesach? Does it mean the end of the Karban Pesach, the end time of when you're finally allowed to start bringing the Karban Pesach? In other words, until you reach the time, I should say, until you reach the time when you could start bringing the Karban Pesach. We had a few different interpretations, but the Gemara didn't seem satisfied with any of those. So the simple understanding is until Pesach is over. So you continue asking for rain until Pesach is over. That would be the simple translation of this. Reb Meir actually Nisan. Reb Meir says until Nisan is over. So Rabbi Yehuda, if you remember in the Gemara, it said that there's 2 sources that understand Rabbi Yehuda differently. One said Rabbi Yehuda says that you ask until the first day of Pesach. Our Mishnah says, is another author who's quoting Rabbi Yehuda, and he's saying that's really until the end of Pesach. And then we have the opinion of Reb Meir that you ask for rain ad sheyetze Nisan until the end, until Nisan leaves, until Nisan is over, you ask for rain. Shenemar, as it says in a pasuk, the Yered Lachem Geshem Moiru Malkish, rain, both the early rains and the late rains will rain Berishain, or rained on the first month, which is Nisan. So you see, Nisan is a time of rain. And so we're going to stop here. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.